Hello, my name's Brian Williams. I'm a Professor of Medicine at University College London and also a physician at University College Hospital. And I'm joined today by Becky Shipley, who's Professor of Healthcare Engineering here at UCL and also head of our Healthcare Engineering Institute. And we're going to be talking about the COVID pandemic and in particular, the really important part played by the partnership between our clinicians at University College Hospital and our engineering team at UCL in developing a breathing device which has been widely deployed across the NHS and globally to help improve the survival of patients who were very sick during the early phases of that pandemic. So Becky, how did this all begin?
Well, for me, it really started happening in the middle of March. I think it was around the 16th of March when the government was putting out the big ventilator challenge to try and corral engineers and manufacturers to make ventilators. And I already knew some of the critical care teams at UCH very well. So I went for a drink with Mervyn Singer. We went for a beer in the common room to discuss how our engineers could contribute to the COVID challenge. And it became very clear very quickly that there was a real role we could play in trying to design and manufacture these non-invasive breathing devices at scale very quickly. And the emphasis was really on the at pace bit. So this was kind of the 17th of March. And the surge, I think, at that time was predicted to reach a peak by the Easter weekend. So, we had weeks. But I think we were really well placed. So we've got fantastic mechanical engineers here at UCL. We obviously have this really strong partnership with the clinicians and the healthcare teams at UCH. And the other missing piece was the industry expertise. And again, our professor, Tim Baker, has got a long history of working in the motorsports industry and immediately reached out to Mercedes, HPP, who are the teams who make the Formula One engines for Lewis Hamilton. So with that kind of trio of expertise, we felt we were really well placed to be able to respond really quickly.
It's pretty remarkable because, whilst all that was going on, and I do remember coming over, actually, we had a chat very early on in the process. I then deployed in the emergency department at University College Hospital because many of our clinical academics really got to the front line of clinical care. So I was down there in the emergency department seeing the patients as they were arriving, and it was pretty horrific. So I could see where Mervyn was coming from because many of the patients were arriving very sick and in desperate need of oxygen that they just couldn't get into their bodies. And at that point, we only have two options. We either increase the amount of oxygen we deliver, but in many cases that wasn't enough. And then the next option is you then move straight to mechanical ventilation, which involves putting a tube into the patient and breathing for them. Now, the challenge there was, firstly, we were panicking about whether we'd have enough ventilators, which is why Mervyn, I guess, began the conversation. Yeah. But secondly, we already knew from the first few cases that had gone onto ventilators in other parts of Europe, in Italy and Spain, two things happened. Firstly, they were often on ventilators for huge amounts of time, weeks. And secondly, they developed a very severe fulminant series of complications related to clotting abnormalities in the blood, abnormalities in kidney function and function of other organs that inevitably led to a worse survival on ventilators than we would normally see in patients with other severe diseases. As many as 50% didn't make it. And that was tragic. So we were realizing as clinicians that if we were going to get through this, that we needed an intermediate solution where we didn't go to ventilation in everybody, but actually we were able to support their breathing with something more than a bit of oxygen or even a lot of oxygen. And that's where this continuous positive airways pressure or system came in, CPAP we call it, where we're able to deliver a high pressure of oxygen into the lungs and therefore improve the level of oxygenation. I mean, had you heard of CPAP before all this
I've heard of CPAP for sleep apnea, so for a very different setting, of course. But I'd heard of them being used obviously in respiratory wards, but I hadn't worked on CPAPs before, so that this was a new project for us. But the CPAPs that we ended up mass manufacturing were a reverse engineered version of the Respironics whisper flow device,
I
which had
remember
been
that device from my junior doctor days.
exactly, and that's
Yeah.
how everyone that we talked to responded. They had this kind of warm glow of remembering.
Oh,
Well,
I
remember
heard
using
David
them.
Brearley went and found one in a cupboard or something.
Exactly.
From ITU. Yeah.
So we found some in the anaesthesia museum and cut them open. But they're very simple devices. So
Yeah.
they're purely mechanical devices. There's no embedded electronics, and that meant that we had a hope of understanding them and manufacturing them quickly. So our first step was to exactly replicate the whisper flow, and that was our Mark I device. And we basically managed to go from our first meeting to within 100 hours being back in UCH testing the first prototypes that had been made by Mercedes. Yeah. And then within 10 days of that first meeting, we'd got regulatory approvals. So we did healthy volunteer studies, we presented a whole dossier of documentation to the MHRA and received approvals for that Mark I, which was an exact replica of the whisper flow. But the other component that was a really tough conversation point at the time was the oxygen, the availability of oxygen. And the whisper flows were relatively oxygen hungry, but were obviously designed for a system where oxygen wasn't a limiting factor. So we then did a lot of design work to reduce the oxygen utilisation. So we did a Mark II device where we redesigned things like the air entrainment port and managed to reduce the oxygen utilisation by up to 70%. And I think that was really pivotal to enable this device to be rolled out in the NHS. Well, I think it was the 28th of March from memory that CPAP joined the NHS care pathway as a whole for treating COVID patients. And I remember that being a big moment because it meant that there was a shift in prioritising the use of CPAP for COVID patients as well as ventilation.
So it does show how an organisation has been able to respond in a remarkable and agile way. And I'd put it to you, Becky, that part of that is due to the fact that, if not the most part of it, is due to the fact that we have our NIHR Biomedical Research Centre, and one of the major objectives that I've had as director of that centre has been to bring medicine closer to disciplines beyond the traditional biological sciences, and that's particularly the STEM subjects and particularly engineering. And we formed a very powerful link, and that surely had to be important as a platform to enable us to drive this so fast, because how else could this have happened?
I completely agree. This happened because of the strength of relationships that were already in place. We hadn't all worked together on ventilators or CPAPs before, but we had existing relationships. We were part of this interdisciplinary community that spans UCL and UCLH. And so we were just ready to move.
I saw the impact because I was involved in we had a multidisciplinary team in the hospital to develop our care pathway. So when these patients came in and they needed oxygen desperately, firstly, we turned up the oxygen to the maximum with the mask, and we waited to see whether that brought the oxygen up. If it didn't, as I said earlier, those patients either went to ventilation, or if they were just not suitable to be ventilated because they would never have survived going on ventilation, there was very little option left. So this is where we deployed CPAP. We gave these people CPAP, and amazingly, certainly in our experience, a significant percentage of those patients recovered their oxygen levels on CPAP and never went on a ventilator. So that was important. And secondly, there were those patients who might never have gone on a ventilator because clinically it was thought that they wouldn't survive the process of ventilation, who then went on and survived and left hospital because of CPAP. So it worked. I mean, was that the impression that you I know you've been quite close to this because you've been gathering some of the data.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's exactly my impression. I remember when Mervyn was first talking to teams in Italy and China in particular, they were quoting around 50 to 60% of patients would be alleviated from needing mechanical ventilation through CPAP. And I think those kind of stats were borne out through the UCH experience for a start. But also, if you look back, I think, at the data over the first surge of intensive care patients, over that time, the use of mechanical ventilation reduced by about 26% for equally sick patients, and mortality decreased by about 23%. So there's other contributory factors, but and I think that trajectory has continued into Surge 2. We're now in a position where our CPAPs are in about 160 NHS hospitals and are continuing to go out on a weekly basis. So they've been taken up by the NHS.
I think that's remarkable. I mean, not just the outcome statistics, but actually in those very fraught moments where you're seeing a patient for the first time who's very, very sick and actually, not necessarily that long away from dying unless we're able to do something. CPAP also bought us some time.
Yeah.
So, there's only a limited amount of time where you can not be able to get the oxygen up before you're in real trouble.
Yeah.
And if the high flow oxygen didn't work, then the only option we had was to go to rapid ventilation.
Yeah.
And that in itself is a fraught thing to try and do and put staff at risk, etc. So I think under these circumstances, the ability to buy some time and make decisions and find out a bit more about the patient, etc., and the patient's wishes, because some patients have wishes that they don't want to go on ventilation.
Of course,
was really important as well. It was that human side of things when you're in the front line in medicine is incredibly important, and it really helped us. There's no doubt about that. Now, it's not just us as a University College Hospital, which is a fantastic hospital, but it actually goes across the NHS.
Yes, absolutely. And I think, the other indicator is the international uptake.
Yeah.
So we got media attention for this and very quickly started getting approaches from other countries around how they could get access to the devices. So we released all of the designs open source, and they've been downloaded across 105 countries around 2,000 times. And there's a whole series of teams now who are manufacturing at scale in country, so in Latin America, India, Pakistan, the Philippines, and I've got regulatory approvals and are doing clinical evaluations and rolling these devices across their healthcare systems. So, I think the impact has been fantastic with the NHS, but the buy-in from the international community has been phenomenal as well, and that the combination of those two for me has been so exciting.
I think that captures it all. I mean, in the sense that we're clinical academics, or academics, and also to see the impact beyond the usual metrics, where people say I've got an exciting publication or I've just got a new grant, which people get excited about, but actually to see impact at such speed that actually genuinely has changed the way we practice in the country. And has undoubtedly, in my view, and I can say this from somebody who's seen it deployed and in front of patients, has improved the chances of survival of patients coming into the hospital. I mean, that's real. I mean, that is impact. Yeah. There's the kind of impact that you really can't go beyond, actually, in many ways.
No, it's been a real journey for me, I think, as an individual, because as an engineer, you would normally think, well, if I develop a medical device in health, for healthcare delivery, that might take a decade. It's going to take a bulk of your career, basically. But through this initiative, we've gone from a standing start to actually rolling a device out into the NHS within a month. So to have had the opportunity to do that has been phenomenal, and I think
it's been a fantastic achievement. As you say, it's a team effort. I mean, it's a team effort that's dependent on the kind of structures that we've put in place to make sure that we deliver translation of science, at UCL into patients in our hospital, but then ultimately cascade that discovery and proof of efficacy to the rest of the NHS. And that to me, in many ways, captures the essence of what our biomedical centres are about. People don't always get it, and they wonder about whether we just benefit the people fortunate enough to be treated in the hospitals that are allied to these large investments in biomedical research. But this is a good example, a very good example of where you get rapid permeation of the expertise and the capability that was delivered here across the whole system. And we've got to do more of it. Thank you very much, Becky. That was a really interesting conversation.
Thank you.